Hello number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking. Let's jump right into it. Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Did I like the trailer? Did it get me excited? Absolutely, it's outstanding work, very high production quality. However, there are a few things that I did not like that I saw on the trailer, mostly because, as you know, I'm a history buff and I like seeing historical accuracy both in video games and movies. Although I've got to say before I start pointing these things out to you that I'm totally aware that this is a product of fiction. It's historical fantasy. It's a video game loosely based on history. It's not high fantasy. We're not talking about a game set in a completely different world, such as, I don't know, Lord of the Rings or the world of Asham of Heroes of Might and Magic. It is set in our world, but there is also a heavy component of fantasy. This is not a historical interactive documentary. We understand that. Majority of people wouldn't even like that. I would, because I mean, I love history, but I understand that this is a product that has to be targeted towards a wider audience. Therefore, you will see a mix of fantasy and a little bit of history just to spice it up. So that's perfectly understood. This is in fact a sort of disclaimer to say that this is not a critique nor an attack towards the game, but it is also important, I think, to understand how things actually were during the Viking Age. And I'd like to help you out and point out, for those of you who are not really that versed into history, point out the things that actually are not historically correct or the anachronism on the video. Again, not a critique, not an attack. It's just as an opportunity to learn while we talk about a product and a game series that we love. Now, for those of you who are here for the first time, please consider becoming a number one. Subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron. And with that being said, let's have a look at the video. We're not really looking at a historically accurate representation of the Viking Age. We are looking at a representation, very accurate representation of the TV series Vikings. Let's be honest, that's what we are looking at. Which personally I don't mind, because I enjoyed watching the first 3 series of Vikings, but that's what we are seeing. The representation of what we see is not very historical. But what happened to the costume department is what really baffled me, because we have a massive difference between the way the general population is represented, so the sort of tunics that we see worn by both children in the very beginning of the trailer, but also, you know, the general people that we see in the background, and the way the protagonists of this video game are represented and the sort of stuff that they are wearing, namely the actual raiders and plunderers. The main difference being that the tunics worn by the children are actually okay. They are in good shape, they are clean, and this is already a big improvement, because usually whenever we see either the Viking Age, the so-called Dark Ages, or the medieval period represented, we always see people being all dirty, muddy, and miserable. They have chosen a pale blue, which is excellent, because that would have been a very common shade, particularly as a mundane kind of color. Other colors we should see in the general populace should be shades of grey and brown, but also brick red, pink, and yellows, which were fairly common because they weren't difficult to dye. Very bright colors could be expected, but only worn by the rich, and that's the same for actually a very pitch black or a brilliant white. These were exceptionally difficult to produce. The Northern Europeans had several different kinds of fiber available: wool, flax, nettle, hemp, linen, and if you were particularly well off, you could import silk. Now, wool and linen would be the preferred choices for garments. If the characters in the game are wearing colorful clothing, then probably should be wool, as linen is really difficult to dye naturally. Now, we see a lot of leather worn by the warriors. Naturally colored leather was used for belts. In fact, I'm actually pleased with the belts, also because the buckles look pretty good. Steel buckles, brass buckles would have been the norm. Wealthy Vikings could have had silver buckles, but a woolen tunic should be the norm. Stitching should be small and neat, not the sort of stitching that we usually see in games such as Skyrim, for example. I hope they don't go that route, which looks like it's been made by a caveman. The Norse were quite sophisticated with the production of their clothes. Now, if we look at long tunics or kirtles, the simplest one that we should see would have splits on the sides from hem to waist. These would be used as the main garment during summer, but they would be used as an undergarment during winter. So this is winter. We should probably see them wearing multiple layers. For a more complex version, we should also be seeing gusseted kirtles, which was the most popular. The reason being that they were warmer. We have examples found in the marsh of Skjoldenham, which is in the Norwegian island of Andøya in Vasterol. Now, if you're interested in this, you can find this specific body in the Museum of Tromsø. And for the pronunciation of these words, I have to thank my friend Brynjar. Very cool guy and historical reenactor. Thank you so much. Tack. Should they be wearing trousers? Absolutely. Possibly woolen, although we don't really know. Socks were as common as they are today for both sexes. And length would vary from ankle length all the way to socks that were quite long. We have a lot of fur, and I remember my friend Shad over at Shadiversity channel underlining this. I sort of partially agree with him, meaning that yes, this kind of fur that you see here, very barbaric looking, basically wearing dead animals. Yes, the Norse didn't do this, but they did use fur, so we can't really say that it's completely inaccurate to represent them wearing fur, but it would look completely different. For example, if you had a very rich Norse, he would have been wearing a mantle with a whole trim and rimming of fur, beautifully made. Now, on the Gotland picture stones, we see representations of hoods used by the Norse. Sheepskin or lambskin hats were used as a standalone or as something you would wear underneath your helmet, and you would see some fur on hats. And having the brim turned up to show the fur is actually consistent with iconography. You just have to look at the door lintel of Gold Church in North Jutland. The real Norse, the real Vikings would have been clean, they would have been groomed. Also in terms of the sort of weapons and armor, again, this has been said already, so I'm not going to dwell on this, but the business end of these access to thickness in armor and weapons, however, sometimes is also a design choice. So I'm not going to complain about this too much, because at the end of the day, I think one of the reasons why video game developers increase the thickness of weapons and armor in games is because we, generally speaking, look at the character from distance, and therefore if they make them too thin, it might not look as good on our screens. But just so you know, a real Viking axes would have been a lot thinner, because an axe with that thickness of iron, it couldn't be wielded. It doesn't matter if you're strong, it doesn't matter if you're tough. The shields are where I draw the line, and I really hope they change this. Viking shields were centered bossed, no questions about that. These shields instead are strapped. Now, strapped circular shields existed, but they are either a medieval thing or a Greek thing. Some Roman auxilia also used strap shield, possibly some Roman gladiators also used strap shield, but the Norse, they had centered bossed shields, so these shields should not be strapped, and instead in this trailer everyone is using a strapped shield. And what drives me nuts is that this is a Ubisoft game. For Honor is also a Ubisoft game, and a lot of people have said no, they probably strapped it on the arm because that makes it a lot easier to animate, but it's not true. They did it. The Warlord, one of the main Viking characters, the heroes that you can play in For Honor, is holding a centered boss shield, and they got all the animations right. Although in that game as well we have a similar situation. The heroes got the centered boss shield, but the Norse minions, if you will, don't. I don't know why they do this. Maybe because the general public usually imagines a shield to be strapped on your arm. I think they should change that, because it's such a defining factor of the way of combat of the Norse that I think they really need to do that. It's too characteristic. Lack of helmets. The first piece of equipment that a warrior would be wearing would be a helmet, because you need to protect your head. When you go for combat, if you can't afford armor, you would at least wear a helmet, and people who do it professionally, no questions. At least the most important one should be wearing helmets, and I understand, again, it's a cinematic choice. They want you to see and appreciate the face and facial expressions of the heroes. But then again, you don't have to have the character wear the helmet for the entirety of the trailer. The very beginning, when he's being blessed by that sort of pagan priestess, he doesn't need to wear the helmet there, so you can already familiarize with the good looking face of the protagonist. When he's on the ship, he doesn't need to wear it, but when he's ready to engage in combat, you could have a scene where he's actually putting on the helmet. And I'm sure there will be helmets in the game. I would have liked to see helmets here, at least during combat. Then if you really want me to see the face of the hero, you can have him lose the helmet for whatever reason. And since we're talking about helmets, what the heck happened with this guy? I mean, I am buying this game because I want to have at least a little bit of Viking vibes. I don't care if it's fantasy. But what is this guy doing here? And I really need to dive into this because I want you to appreciate how much of an anachronistic figure this is. Now, clearly anyone, even if you have never opened a book of history, the moment you look at this guy, you'll think Roman. What the heck is a Roman doing in the 9th century? And this is important to underline. We are specifically in the 9th century. Ubisoft tells us when this game is set. A helmet with a red crest, which is clearly Roman, not centurion crest. I'd like to underline, like it's been said, this is not a centurion crest, because that would have been a horizontal crest, but it's the sort of crest that we know possibly Roman soldiers had and wore only during parade rather than during battle, because in battle it would be centurions to wear horizontal crests. It gives us Roman vibes, and then the helmet itself looks like it's inspired by the Saturn Who helmet, an Anglo-Saxon helmet with a Roman looking crest on a character that is wearing a bronze scale armor while he wields a late 14th to 15th century longsword. What on earth is going on? Anyways, I do appreciate though the fact that his armor actually blocks the cut of the protagonist. I love that one. That was really good. Now, having said all this, in the next section we're going to look at the settlement, the buildings, and some other factors that need to be addressed for us to fully understand what's going on in this trailer. Before I do this, I need to give a shout out to a person. His name is Roberto, and he's got a page, both a Facebook page and a blog called Un Italiano in Islanda, so an Italian in Iceland. He, as far as I understand, he is a professor, and he made a video, and you'll find a link in the description below, where together with other two academics, very knowledgeable people, they talk about this trailer and they underline some things that, for example, I didn't know. And he also talks specifically about the drekar, so the wrongly called Drakar ships that the Norse use and they're famous for. Credit where credit is due. Check him out. The video's in Italian, so I suppose only for those of you who understand Italian, but very, very knowledgeable on Norse culture. So you'll find again a link in the description below. Thank you so much, Roberto. Grazie, Roberto, per il tuo lavoro. First, we look at this building that we see in the back. Now, this is a Norwegian building, but it's a Christian building. Whether it be some sort of ceremonial or religious building, or whether it be an administrative building, doesn't really matter. It shouldn't have more than two sections. Instead, we see that it has a third section which makes it specifically Christian, and something that you wouldn't have seen at this time, and particularly in a scenario where we see that we are looking at the Norse before their conversions to Christianity. So that is a big mistake. Now, the dragon ships, they are very well made. The shields on the sides are correct, and that is because they needed to put them there because you need that space for the men. Again, piece of information that Roberto said I found particularly interesting. But the ships are too numerous. They were very expensive. They would cost as much as a farming land with buildings in it. So you wouldn't see an entire Norse or Viking fleet made of these specific warships, which were high-end, top-notch technology of the time. Instead, we should see a couple of these, and the rest of the ships should be lesser vessels. The representation of the battle that we see, and this is something that I already knew, we see again this idea of people using the momentum of the charge, running on foot and trying to smash onto their enemies. There are no formation, and we know that that's not the case for both lines. Both factions used shield walls. The Norse did, the Anglo-Saxons did. So what we would have actually seen would have been two opposing factions moving forward slowly in formation with shield walls. This idea of I've got to run and charge into my enemy, that's how cavalry works. It's not like infantry of the time worked, and generally speaking it's not how infantry worked anytime. So from a cinematic point of view it's fantastic, but let's just keep in mind that's not how battles were fought. We see a very important historical figure in this trailer, and that is King Alfred the Great. I love the fact that we see him. I think that has such a potential, and I think that's going to be great. But on the document we see the word war, which is too modern of a word. It's not a word that the Anglo-Saxons would have used. This is a little linguistic detail, and I understand that they wrote it there so that people can familiarize, but it's important to say he would not have said that word. Also, the way he looks, the sort of blue and red garment that he's wearing, and the overall looks of this king makes him look very late medieval, even French in a way. Very continental, to say the least. That's not how an Anglo-Saxon king of the 9th century would have looked. And his, whatever it is, bodyguard over there wearing that sort of thin leather armor, again, no. A high-end bodyguard of the king would have been wearing mail. Also, again, big thanks to Roberto for noticing that this pen here wouldn't have the plumage. That would have been removed. Anyway, so to cut a long story short, I am very excited for the trailer, but we need to keep in mind we are basically playing the TV series Vikings. As you can see, there are a lot of things that are not historically accurate, and these things, I think some of these things should be changed because they can be changed. I'm not saying turn it into a historically accurate documentary, but I'm saying at least the shield grip, at least the armor worn by the protagonist, these things are not going to influence negatively. I understand you want to keep that kind of very fantasy looking, that kind of hairstyle, because if you look at historical hairstyle, you know, shaved on the sides and short on the head, on the top, probably not going to be interesting for the majority of people. So sure, keep that ideal fictional representation of the Norse warrior. I'm okay with that, but you know, if you put a helmet on top, it's not going to ruin anything. So I think that's something that I would like to see in the actual finished product. So what do you think, noble ones? What would you like to see changed, and what things do you like? Do you agree with what I said, or do you have more to bring to the table? But please let me know in the comments below, and most importantly, let me know if you're going to buy this game. Personally, I'm going to order the digital edition, but if you do end up getting the collectors, I've got to say that thing looks really good. The statue of the protagonist, the female version, looks absolutely stunning. I like it a lot. I like the little bit of the ship, the Drekar, that we can see appearing over there. It's a bit expensive, but I think it's really beautiful. So if you do get that one, well, good for you. Definitely let me know what you think in the comments below. Okay, noble ones, well, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember, thumbs up, and if you're yet not members of this community, become a noble one. Subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.